A gym full of people. Applause, but it doesn't sound like applause should. Somewhere in the noise, a microphone catches a woman's voice, bright and certain. And I just think it's so important that we take care of our own, don't you? Malik, sweetheart, come on up here. A pause. A kid's sneakers on hardwood. We've arranged for Value Barn to cover your class trip fee this year. As a little hardship scholarship. More applause. Somewhere in the crowd, a woman isn't clapping. She's just standing there, watching a room decide who she is. That woman is Angela Mercer. And in about 2 weeks, that same gym is going to hear something else entirely. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's back up. Fenwick Heights isn't the kind of town anybody puts on a postcard. It's the kind of town with one good diner, a river that used to power a mill nobody remembers the name of, and an elementary school where half the parents at drop-off knew each other's parents. Ridgeline Elementary sits 3 blocks off Main Street, brick building, chain-link fence around the playground, the kind of school that's been repainted the same beige 4 times in 30 years. Every morning at 7:45, Angela Mercer pulls her minivan into the drop-off line. Same spot, more or less, 3rd car back from the crosswalk. Same gray hoodie half the days of the week. Same quiet nod to the crossing guard, who waves at her the way you wave at somebody you've decided you already understand. Angela is 41. She's black, she's deaf, and she's been raising her son Malik on her own since before he could walk. She doesn't talk much out loud, not because she can't, but because her voice came out different after she lost her hearing, and she got tired a long time ago of people's faces doing that polite little flinch when she used it. Easier to sign, easier to text, easier to let people fill in their own blanks. And people do fill in blanks. That's just what people do. At Ridgeline, the other parents look at Angela the same 3 outfits on rotation. The minivan with the dent in the back bumper she's never bothered fixing, the flat way she talks when she does talk, and they've decided, without ever once asking her, that she's getting by. Barely. Some of them assume she's on assistance. Nobody's rude about it, not exactly. It's worse than rude, actually. It's just quiet. A kind of gentle, well-meaning erasure. Nobody asks Angela Mercer what she does for a living, because everybody's already decided they know. They don't know. Here's what they don't know. Angela owns buildings. 11 of them, actually scattered across 3 neighborhoods on the working-class side of town: strip malls, a laundromat block, a row of little storefronts that used to sit half-empty until she started buying them up one at a time. One of those strip malls, Fenwick Plaza, out on the east side near the highway, happens to be where Value Barn sits. The same Value Barn that's sponsoring Ridgeline's Fall Carnival this year. Nobody at that school has any reason to connect those dots, because Angela never gave them the dots to connect. Her name isn't on the mailbox of any of those buildings. It's not on the deed, not the way anybody would ever see it. The properties sit under a company called Mercer Holdings, and Mercer Holdings doesn't own the buildings directly. Either each one sits in its own separate little company, the kind of unglamorous paperwork any small landlord with half a lawyer would set up, mostly so one leaky roof at one building can't take down everything else she's built. It's boring. It's the kind of structure accountants yawn through. Nobody's hiding a body in it. It's just how you keep a small portfolio from becoming one bad afternoon away from disaster. And even the paperwork that does exist doesn't say Angela Mercer anywhere a stranger would stumble across it. She pays a service, same as plenty of landlords do, to handle the official registered agent stuff, the address on file, the piece of mail nobody reads. Day to day, the actual leasing gets handled by a management company she runs quietly on the side, Fenwick Group Management, and the woman doing that legwork, a sharp, easygoing property manager named Priya Anand, genuinely has no idea her boss is a single mom who drops her kid off at Ridgeline every morning in a 10-year-old minivan. To Priya, Angela's just a landlord client. A good one. Detail-oriented. Answers emails fast. That's the whole relationship. So when Value Barn's manager sits down to sign a lease, or when the school's fundraising committee works out sponsorship details with the store, the name Angela Mercer never once comes up. Why would it? She's not in the room. She's never in the room. That's rather the point of how she built this: leases, inspections, contracts, all of it running through email and paper, none of it requiring her to sit across a table from someone straining to read her lips over the hum of an air conditioner. It wasn't always this way. Angela used to have a very different plan for her life. She was 19, a sophomore in a music education program, training to be a choir and band teacher. She played piano, good enough to teach it, good enough that a professor once told her she had real ears for arrangement. Then she got sick. Meningitis, they told her later, once the fever broke and the ringing didn't stop, and then the ringing stopped too, and so did everything else. 6 weeks, and her hearing was gone for good. There was no real path back into that music program for a deaf student. Not at that school. Not then. Nobody was cruel about it. They just didn't have a plan for her, and she didn't have the fight left that year to build one for herself. So she left. Spent about 2 years adrift, picking up whatever work she could find that didn't ask too much of her voice. Then her aunt died and left her a duplex. Small thing, needed work, mice in the walls, one unit with a bathtub that hadn't drained right since the Clinton administration. Angela couldn't afford a contractor, so she fixed it herself, watched videos, borrowed tools, learned to sweat a pipe joint by doing it wrong twice first. Rented it out. Did it again with the money. And again. Turned out she was good at this. Really good. And it fit her in a way teaching never could have any more. Nobody needs to hear you to sign a lease. Nobody needs you to speak clearly to negotiate a purchase price over email. For the first time since she was 19, Angela had found work that didn't require the world to slow down and be patient with her. She just had to be patient with the world and the numbers, and that was a trade she was more than willing to make. 12 years later, here she is. Same hoodie, same minivan, 11 buildings nobody at Ridgeline Elementary has ever heard of. At home, none of that matters much anyway. What matters at home is 8:15 at night. Lights low in Malik's room, and Angela sitting on the edge of his bed the way she has every single night since he was small enough to fit against her side. She signs him something before he sleeps, not a real ASL phrase, nothing you'd find in a book. She made it up herself, back in the hospital, the year she was still relearning how to be a person who couldn't hear. It's clumsy, if you know real ASL. It doesn't follow the grammar. But it's hers, and it roughly means you are my sound now, and Malik has had it signed to him every night of his life without ever once questioning whether it was correct. Why would he? It's just what his mom does. It's just theirs. Weekends are simpler than people probably imagine, too. There's a running feud with next door about whose tomato plants are doing better this summer. An actual bathroom scale gets hauled out onto the porch most August to settle it, and that has never once let Angela forget the year she won by 4 ounces. There's the county fair every fall, where Angela enters her pie in the fruit category and has taken first place 3 years running, and where she will absolutely not pretend to be humble about it if you ask her. It's a small life. A good one. Quiet in the way she's built it to be quiet. Which is exactly why the fall carnival was going to be a problem nobody saw coming. Because that Friday, Ridgeline Elementary was about to decide, out loud, in front of the whole gym, exactly who they thought Angela Mercer was. They were about to find out how wrong they'd been. Just not yet. The Ridgeline Elementary Fall Carnival happens the same weekend every year, the Friday before Halloween. Gym doors open at 6. Cider in a big orange cooler by the entrance. A cakewalk that never quite works because nobody can agree on when the music's supposed to stop. Value Barn had signed on as the main sponsor back in September, which meant a banner over the stage, a table of donated raffle prizes, and a 15-minute slot at the microphone for whoever the fundraising committee decided should have it. That person was Carol Denniston. Carol had been president of the parent fundraising committee for going on 3 years, and if you asked anybody at Ridgeline to describe her, they'd probably use the word tireless before they used any other word. She organized the carnival. She organized the book fair. She was the reason the teachers got a decent gift basket at the holidays instead of whatever got left over in the supply closet. Carol Denniston ran on the fuel of being needed, and being seen being needed, and there is nothing villainous in that on its own. Plenty of good gets done by people who need to be needed. It's just that the fuel burns hot, and sometimes it burns in directions you didn't mean to point it. Carol had never had a real conversation with Angela Mercer. Not once, not really. A nod at drop-off here and there. A group text about the class trip that Angela always answered late, because group texts are exhausting to keep up with when you're reading them instead of hearing them chime, sorting through 50 replies to figure out what actually got decided. Carol had filled in that silence with a story of her own, a story about a tired single mom just barely keeping her head above water. A woman who probably needed a little extra grace, a little extra help, the kind of person Carol had built her entire identity around rescuing. She wasn't wrong to want to help people. She was wrong about who needed it. It had started small, the way these things usually do. Back in September, when the class trip fee letters went home, Carol had noticed or thought she'd noticed that Angela's reply to the permission slip email had come in almost a full week after everyone else's, short, just a few words, no explanation. Carol had decided, on her own, without checking, that this meant something. A few days later, she'd mentioned to another committee mom, Denise, that she was a little worried about the Mercer situation. And Denise, who also didn't really know Angela beyond a wave at pickup, had nodded along the way people do when someone speaks with enough certainty. By October, the Mercer situation had become a small, quiet project of Carol's, not malicious, not even really conscious, just a slow accumulation of a story nobody had bothered to check against the actual person it was about. Carol had even, a few weeks before the carnival, quietly submitted Malik's name to the district's Financial Hardship Assistance Fund for the class trip, filling out the form herself, checking boxes about household income she had no actual information about, guessing at numbers because nobody had ever told her not to guess. She hadn't asked Angela first. It hadn't occurred to her that she needed to. In Carol's mind, this was simply what a good committee president did. She noticed the families who needed help, and she got them help, and asking first would have meant risking the family's pride, which felt, to Carol, like the more compassionate way to handle it. It never once crossed her mind that the compassionate thing and the correct thing might not be the same thing at all. At 7:40 that Friday night, with the gym close to full and the raffle numbers about to be called, Carol took the microphone for what was supposed to be a 2-minute segment thanking Value Barn for its sponsorship. She had notes. She'd practiced this part. "We've got one more thing before the raffle," Carol said, and the room quieted the way rooms do for a teacher's voice, even when the teacher isn't actually a teacher. Every year, this committee looks for a family in our school community who could use a little lift. And this year, Value Barn generously agreed to help us do something we're really proud of. Angela was standing near the back wall by the folding tables, half watching, half distracted by Malik tugging at her sleeve about a raffle ticket he'd dropped. She caught maybe a third of what Carol was saying. The gym had bad acoustics under the best circumstances, brick walls, a domed ceiling built for basketball games, not speeches, and even with her hearing aid turned up, even reading what she could off Carol's mouth from 30 feet away under fluorescent light. Most of it came through in fragments. Family. Lift. Proud. Angela didn't think, even for a second, that any of it was about her. "Malik Mercer," Carol said. "Sweetheart, come on up here." There's a particular kind of silence that happens in a crowded room when one specific kid gets called out by name. Every head near Malik turns toward him first, before anyone even knows why. Malik, 10 years old, didn't yet have the instinct to be embarrassed. He just heard his name and grinned and started walking toward the stage, the way any kid does when a grown-up with a microphone says his name in a nice voice. Angela's stomach had already started to sink before she understood why. She was reading Carol's mouth now, catching up, piecing it together a half-beat behind the room. "We've arranged for Value Barn to cover Malik's class trip fee this year," Carol said, beaming, one hand resting on Malik's shoulder like she'd known him his whole life. "As a little hardship scholarship, because that's what this community does. We take care of our own." Applause. Genuine, warm, well-meant applause, rolling across the gym in that easy way applause does when a room believes it's just witnessed something kind. Angela wasn't clapping. She was standing at the back of a gym full of people she saw every single morning, watching her son's name get read out loud as a hardship case, watching 30 or 40 families she nodded at during drop-off decide, in real time, exactly what kind of mother she was. Nobody had asked her permission. Nobody had asked her anything. The class trip fee was $90. Angela could have written a check for the entire year's field trips without looking at her bank balance twice. That wasn't the injury. The injury was smaller and worse than money. It was standing in a room while it clapped for its own kindness toward you, without ever once bothering to find out if you wanted it, or needed it, or asked for it. Here's the part of the story that matters more than Carol standing at that microphone. Look around that gym for a second. There were teachers there. There was Priya Anand's neighbor, coincidentally 3 rows back, who worked at the bank and had processed a mortgage payoff for a Fenwick Plaza LLC 8 months earlier, and never once connected the initials on the wire transfer to the woman across the gym. There was Dot, Angela's own next-door neighbor, standing by the cider table, close enough to see Angela's face change. Dot noticed. Dot saw the exact moment Angela's expression went flat in that particular way it goes flat when something's landed hard, and she's decided not to let it show. And Dot didn't say anything. Not because Dot didn't care. Dot cared plenty. But it happened fast, and it happened in public, and calling it out in the moment would have meant standing up in a gym full of her neighbors and contradicting a well-liked committee president in front of everyone. And Dot, like most decent people in most rooms like that, did the math on that kind of confrontation in about a second and a half, and let it go. That's worth sitting with for a moment. Not to blame Dot. To ask yourself something. How many rooms have you been in where you saw it happening, saw somebody get quietly, publicly diminished, and did the same math Dot did? That wasn't the only one. A teacher near the stage, Ms. Faulkner, had felt the same flicker of discomfort she'd had Malik in her class the year before, knew he was sharp, funny, well cared for, and something about hardship scholarship hadn't sat right against what she actually knew of that family. She thought about saying something to Carol afterward. She got as far as walking toward the refreshment table where Carol was accepting compliments on a job well done, and then a parent stepped in front of her with a question about the code drive, and the moment passed the way moments like that pass constantly, in gyms and break rooms and family dinners everywhere. Not out of cruelty, but out of simple human hesitation. That's the part of this story that isn't really about Carol at all. It's about how easy it is to watch something happen and let it keep happening because stopping it would cost you something small and immediate, while doing nothing costs you something you can't see the bill for until much later, if ever. Malik, at least, hadn't understood yet what he was being handed. He came off that stage with a Value Barn gift card and a grin, and it wasn't until the car ride home, windows fogging up a little in the October cold, that he turned to his mom and signed a question that had started to bother him. "Are we poor?" Angela had to sit with that question at a red light for a second before she could answer it. She signed back simply that they were fine, that the school had just gotten something wrong. Malik, being 10, accepted that the way 10-year-olds accept most things adults tell them, and went back to eating cheese crackers out of a plastic bag. Angela didn't go back to feeling fine quite that fast. Here's something people get wrong about stories like this one. They imagine the person who's been wronged runs home and starts building a case, pulls up bank statements, drafts a speech, plans the moment they're going to walk back into that gym and set the record straight. That's not what Angela did. That's not really who Angela is. What Angela did, mostly, was nothing. She went to work Monday morning the way she always did, a walkthrough at one of the smaller strip malls on Delway Street. A conversation with Priya about a tenant 3 months behind on rent who needed either a payment plan or a notice. An afternoon spent going over insurance renewals at the kitchen table after Malik went to bed. She kept baking. She kept losing the tomato fight to Dot, who'd had an unusually good August. She signed Malik his goodnight phrase every night. Same as always, the two of them in the low light of his room. Nothing about it different at all. There's a version of this story where Angela comes home from that carnival furious, and stays furious, and lets that fury reshape the next 2 weeks of her life. That's not what happened, and it's worth saying plainly why, because it says something true about her. Angela had spent 12 years learning that the fastest way to lose ground in a negotiation, in a lease dispute, in almost any conflict that mattered, was to let somebody else's mistake about you become the thing you organized your whole reaction around. She'd watched other small landlords do that, get insulted by a tenant, get patronized by a bank loan officer, and spend so much energy proving a point that they lost sight of the actual business sitting in front of them. Angela had decided a long time ago that being right quietly was worth more than being right loudly. And that decision had made her money, more than once, in rooms that had nothing to do with Ridgeline Elementary. So that Monday and the Monday after, she just kept doing the work. She drove out to the Delway Street property on a gray, drizzly morning to look at a section of roofing a tenant had flagged, standing in a parking lot in the same jeans and boots she wore for every walkthrough, clipboard in hand, while the tenant, a woman who ran a small hair salon out of the end unit, talked her ear off about her daughter's soccer season, having absolutely no idea she was talking to the owner of the building and not some inspector Priya had sent out. Angela nodded along, read what she could off the woman's face, texted Priya a follow-up about a quote for the roof repair, and drove home in time to make dinner. That was the week. Roofing quotes, insurance renewals, a tenant's late payment plan, worked out over 3 patient emails instead of an eviction notice, because Angela had learned that grace, extended carefully and on her own terms, tended to come back to her eventually, in ways she couldn't always predict up front. None of it had anything to do with Carol Denniston. None of it was building toward a confrontation. It was just Angela's actual life, running the way it always ran, underneath the version of her life that Ridgeline Elementary thought it understood. If you'd asked her that week whether she was planning to do anything about what happened at the carnival, she probably would have told you no. Not because she'd forgiven it, because confrontation had never once, in 12 years of building what she'd built, been the tool that worked for her. Quiet had worked. Patience had worked. Letting people underestimate her had, more often than not, made her better deals, not worse ones. There was, however, one piece of business already sitting on her desk that Friday's carnival had nothing to do with, and everything to do with what was coming. Value Barn's lease at Fenwick Plaza was up for a scheduled rent adjustment, that November standard stuff, written into the original lease 5 years earlier, a modest increase tied to the regional market rate. Priya had already flagged it in an email 2 weeks before the carnival, and Angela had already made a decision about it that had nothing to do with anything Carol Denniston had said or would say. Value Barn had been a good, reliable tenant. They paid on time, they kept the storefront clean, and they just put real money behind Ridgeline Elementary's fundraiser, which Angela quietly, privately, without telling a single soul at that school thought was a decent thing for a business to do in a town like Fenwick Heights. So Angela told Priya to hold the increase. Not forgive it, defer it, 2 years, structured so Value Barn's regional office would understand exactly why. A goodwill gesture, tied specifically to community sponsorship. Priya thought it was a nice, reasonable landlord decision, the kind Angela made 2 or 3 times a year for tenants who deserved a break. Priya sent the paperwork over to Value Barn's regional manager, a man named Grant Ostrowski, who read it, appreciated it, and mentally filed away that his landlord, whoever that actually was, some outfit called Mercer Holdings, he'd never given it much thought, was one of the more reasonable ones he'd dealt with in 15 years of retail management. Hold on to that. We'll come back to it. 2 weeks passed. Carol Denniston, for her part, had no idea any of this was happening, and wouldn't have cared if she did as far as she was concerned. The carnival moment had gone exactly the way it was supposed to. She'd helped a struggling family. She'd done it publicly, which mattered to her more than she probably would have admitted, because doing it publicly was, in Carol's mind, the whole point. It wasn't enough to be kind. People needed to see that Ridgeline Elementary took care of its own. Carol had built a version of herself around being the person who made sure of that, and every retelling of the carnival moment in the following days at pickup, in the PTA group chat, at the grocery store, sanded the story down a little further into something simpler and more flattering. We helped that poor Mercer family. Here's the second thing to hold on to. Carol's own history with the word landlord wasn't neutral, and it never had been. 8 years earlier, Carol and her husband had run a small restaurant on the west side of town, nothing fancy, a diner-style place, 12 tables, a Friday fish fry that had a small loyal following. They'd built it from nothing over 6 years. And then their landlord at the time, a property management outfit with no particular loyalty to the tenants inside its buildings, hit them with a steep rent increase the same month their lease came up for renewal. No negotiation, no grace period, just a number that made the math stop working. For months later, the restaurant was gone. Carol had never really talked about it, not in any detail, not at the fundraising committee meetings where she'd built her whole reputation as the person who protected families from exactly that kind of thing. But it sat underneath everything she did. Every fundraiser, every scholarship, every time she used the word landlord like it was already an accusation. She wasn't cruel because she enjoyed being cruel. She was cruel because somewhere along the way, she decided the world was made up of 2 kinds of people: the ones who get their businesses taken from them, and the ones who take them, and she needed, badly, to always be standing on the side of the ones getting protected. She just hadn't checked which side Angela Mercer was actually standing on. There's one more thing worth holding on to before we get to that gym floor again. Grant Ostrowski, in the same email exchange where he'd thanked Priya for the deferred rent increase, had mentioned, almost in passing, that Value Barn's corporate office liked to publicly acknowledge landlords who partnered well with community sponsorships, a small write-up, sometimes, in an internal regional newsletter, nothing anyone at Ridgeline would ever see. He'd asked Priya whether Ms. Mercer wanted her name attached to that acknowledgement, or whether she'd rather it just credit Fenwick Group management generally. Angela had told Priya, without much thought, to leave her name off it. Old habit. She'd been leaving her name off things for 12 years, and it had never once occurred to her that the habit might someday collide with a room full of people who badly needed to see it. Remember that detail. It's going to matter in about 10 minutes. The emergency meeting got called on a Tuesday night, in the same gym, folding chairs set up in a loose horseshoe instead of rows. Grant Ostrowski had reached out to the fundraising committee that week with what he thought was a fairly minor, fairly boring piece of business. Value Barnes' corporate office wanted local sign-off on an updated community sponsorship agreement for next year. And since the store's lease situation was tangled up in the conversation, he figured it made sense to loop the committee in directly, mostly out of courtesy. Carol had heard lease and rent increase somewhere in his message, and Carol, running on 8-year-old fuel she'd never fully examined, had turned it into something else entirely before the meeting even started. "I think we all need to hear this," Carol said, once the room had settled, once Grant had barely gotten 2 sentences into his actual, mild point. "Because this is exactly the kind of thing that happens to small businesses in this town. A store does something good for our kids, and the second it's convenient, the landlord squeezes them for more money. I've seen this before. I've lived this before." Grant, a little confused, tried to clarify that nobody had squeezed anybody, that in fact, the opposite had happened, that the landlord had actually deferred a scheduled increase specifically because of the sponsorship. But Carol was 2 sentences ahead of him, already turning to the room, already building the moment the way she'd built dozens of moments before, certain of her own righteousness in a way that made her stop listening. And this is where Angela Mercer, sitting near the back of the horseshoe with her interpreter beside her, a woman named Renata, there because Ridgeline's meetings, to their credit, had started providing interpretation services after a parent request 2 years back, watched Carol Denniston build an entire argument on a foundation that wasn't there. "Some landlords," Carol said, voice rising slightly, warming to the theme, "don't care one bit about the people underneath them. They'll take a business that's barely hanging on, barely making rent, and squeeze it dry right when it can least afford it. I watched that happen to my own family's restaurant. I am not going to sit here and let it happen to Value Barn while they're literally in the middle of helping our kids." A few parents nodded. A few looked uncomfortable, but stayed quiet, the same math that had done in the gym 2 weeks earlier, playing out again in a smaller room. And then Carol turned, and her eyes landed on Angela, and something in her, some leftover thread of the carnival. The hardship scholarship, the story she'd built where Angela needed protecting, snapped into a different, uglier shape. "Angela," Carol said, and the room went quiet in that particular way it does when a name gets used like a weapon instead of an address. "I know you probably don't follow all this business stuff. It's complicated, but this is what predatory landlords do to families like yours. Families who are just trying to get by." Angela didn't answer right away. Renata's hands were still catching up, translating, and in that gap Carol kept going. And this is the part that would get repeated by everyone in that gym for months afterward, the line that would end up, more or less verbatim, in half a dozen retellings at half a dozen dinner tables across Fenwick Heights. "Some of us actually had to build something to lose it, Angela," Carol said. "You don't get to stand there like you understand what it costs to run a business, when the only thing you've ever had to manage is a disability check." Silence. Not the polite kind, the kind that has weight to it, the kind where you can hear a folding chair creak. Angela sat very still. Renata's hands had gone quiet too, having finished the translation, and for a moment nobody in that gym, not Carol, not Grant, not the dozen or so parents sitting in that horseshoe, knew exactly what was about to happen next. Grant Ostrowski, to his credit, was the one who spoke first, and he wasn't trying to be dramatic. He was trying to correct a factual error, the way you'd correct someone who'd gotten a date wrong. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," Grant said, a little awkwardly, into the silence Carol had left behind. "Nobody's squeezing us on rent. Actually, it's the opposite. Ms. Mercer's team deferred our whole increase this year. 2 years, no strings, once they heard about the sponsorship. Honestly, it's the best lease relationship we've had at any of our locations in 15 years. Carol blinked. "Wait, whose team?" "Mercer," Grant said, still not understanding why the room had gone this quiet. "Mercer Holdings. They own the plaza. I just figured that was already." He stopped, looking around, reading the room a beat too late. "Wait, is that not Angela? Like, you, Angela?" Nobody answered him right away. Renata sat beside Angela with her hands ready, watching Angela's face the way an interpreter learns to watch not for permission, exactly, but for timing. A few parents in the horseshoe were doing quick, silent math of their own now, the same way I had done math in the gym 2 weeks earlier, except this math ran the other direction. One woman near the front, whose son had ridden in the same carpool as Malik for 2 years, sat back in her folding chair like she'd just remembered something she'd said out loud in front of Angela once, something small, something about budgeting for the class trip, something that suddenly felt very different in hindsight. Carol was still standing, still holding the small stack of notes she'd brought for a meeting that had nothing to do with any of this. And for a moment nobody in that gym seemed entirely sure whether to look at her or at Angela, whether the room's attention belonged to the woman who'd just been humiliated for the second time in 2 weeks, or the woman standing in the center of the floor watching her own certainty come apart in real time. Angela let the silence sit for exactly as long as it needed to sit. She wasn't performing anything. She wasn't building toward a big line the way Carol had. When she finally lifted her hands to sign, it was Renata's voice, calm and even, that carried the words into the room. "Yes," Angela signed. "That's me. I own Fenwick Plaza. I own the building Value Barn is in. I made the decision to defer the increase myself about 3 weeks ago because I thought what they were doing for the school was worth supporting." A beat. "I also," she continued, hands moving with no particular urgency, "pay for my son's class trips myself. Every year. I didn't ask for a scholarship at the carnival. Nobody asked me if I wanted one." The room had gone somewhere past silent. Somebody near the front, a father whose name nobody quite remembers now, let out a short, disbelieving laugh, the kind that isn't really about anything being funny. Carol Denniston stood very still in the middle of the gym floor, and you could watch, in real time, the story she'd been telling herself for 8 years, the story about landlords and struggling families, and which side of that line she'd always stood on collapse underneath her, one beam at a time. "I didn't," Carol started and stopped. There wasn't really a sentence that finished that thought in a way that helped her. Angela didn't gloat. That was never going to be the shape of this. She didn't stand up, didn't raise her hands theatrically, didn't wait for the room to turn and look at her differently before delivering some triumphant closing line. She'd spent 12 years building a life specifically so she wouldn't have to perform anything for anybody, and she wasn't about to start now, in a middle school gym, for an audience of people who'd already decided who she was without asking twice. She just signed one more thing, quiet, almost an afterthought, before picking up her bag. "I'm not upset that people didn't know," Angela said through Renata. "I built it that way on purpose. I'm upset that nobody thought to ask before deciding what my life looked like." Then she left. Not stormed out, just left, the way you leave a meeting that's finished saying what it needed to say. Malik wasn't there that night. He was home with a sitter, doing homework at the kitchen table, completely unaware that his mother had just spent 10 minutes rewriting how an entire gym full of neighbors thought about his family. Angela was grateful for that. Driving home, some moments are worth having witnesses. That one, for Malik's sake, wasn't one she needed him to carry. Grant Ostrowski stayed behind for a few minutes after most of the room had cleared out, looking a little shell-shocked himself, mostly because he genuinely hadn't understood the weight of what he'd just said until it had already landed. He caught Priya on the phone later that night, apologizing for what he assumed must have been some kind of confidentiality breach on his end. Priya, just as surprised as he was, had to explain that no, nothing had been breached. Angela had simply never told anyone, and it had never occurred to either of them that anyone needed telling. She never once acted like it was a secret, Priya said, still turning it over in her own head as she said it. She just never brought it up. I didn't think there was anything to bring up. That's the thing about the way Angela built her life. It was never a vault. It was never guarded behind some elaborate scheme designed to keep people in the dark. It was just quiet, the way a lot of true things about a person can be quiet, sitting in plain sight, waiting for somebody to finally ask the right question instead of filling in their own answer. The next few weeks moved faster than the two before them, and the story, once it started moving through Fenwick Heights, moved the way stories like that always do, fast, then everywhere, then slightly different every time you heard it. By Thursday, half of Ridgeline's parent group chat had heard some version of what happened at the meeting. By the following week, the PTA newsletter that had photographed Malik accepting his hardship scholarship 2 weeks earlier ran a quiet 3-paragraph correction. more or less admitting that the family in question hadn't needed or requested the assistance, and thanking Value Barn and Fenwick Plaza's ownership for their support of the school more generally, without going out of its way to name names. It didn't need to. Everyone in town already knew. Carol Denniston didn't get fired. There was nothing to fire her from, and nothing she'd done was illegal. She hadn't stolen money, hadn't broken any rule written down anywhere. What she'd done was worse to sit with in its own way, because there was no clean punishment for it. She'd built a public identity around protecting people from exactly the kind of harm she'd just tried to inflict, and there was no lawsuit that fixes that kind of thing. There was just a town, slowly, quietly, recalibrating how it saw her. The fundraising committee held its regular elections that spring, earlier than usual, and Carol didn't run for president again. Nobody made her step aside. She just didn't put her name forward, and nobody particularly asked her why. For a while, Carol kept turning the meeting over in her own head, the way people do when a story they've told themselves for years suddenly needs rewriting. She thought about the restaurant, about the landlord who'd ended it, about the 8 years she'd spent quietly organizing her whole sense of right and wrong around never letting that happen to anyone else on her watch. She had to sit with the fact that she'd aimed all that old grief at exactly the wrong target, and that the target had never once asked to be anyone's redemption story. It wasn't a comfortable thing to sit with. Nobody made her sit with it publicly, which was, in its own way, more uncomfortable than if they had. There was no dramatic apology scene, no clean moment of forgiveness to close the loop. Just a slow, private reckoning, the kind that doesn't make for a good highlight reel, but tends to actually change a person, if anything does. Grant Ostrowski's regional office, for its part, ended up highlighting the Fenwick Plaza lease relationship in an internal presentation about community partnerships, entirely unaware of the drama underneath it, which is its own small, quiet joke. The most talked-about deal in Fenwick Heights that month became, elsewhere, just a nice slide in a corporate deck about good landlord relationships. This time, when Grant asked whether Ms. Mercer wanted her name on the acknowledgement, Angela told Priya to leave it on. Just her name, nothing more. No statement, no story attached. Some habits are worth keeping. That one, she decided, wasn't. Ms. Faulkner, the teacher who'd almost said something at the carnival and hadn't, brought it up with Angela directly at pickup a few weeks later. Not an apology exactly, more of an honest admission that she'd noticed something was wrong that night and let it slide anyway, and that she didn't plan on doing that again. Angela appreciated it more than she let on. It's a small thing, a teacher deciding out loud to be a little braver next time, but small things like that are usually how a place like Ridgeline Elementary actually changes, if it changes at all, not through some big public reckoning, just one person at a time deciding the math is worth doing differently. The class trip fee, as it turned out, became a strange little footnote of its own. The district's hardship fund had already processed Malik's form by the time the correction ran, and rather than make a fuss about unwinding $90 of paperwork, Angela quietly asked Priya to redirect an equivalent donation to the fund itself, earmarked for a family that actually needed it, no name attached, obviously. Nobody at Ridgeline ever found out where that particular donation came from. Angela preferred it that way. Carol, for her part, didn't disappear from the school entirely. She still showed up to pick up, still volunteered for the book fair that spring. Quieter than before, more careful. A few parents who'd clapped along at the carnival found themselves, in the weeks after the meeting, replaying that night in a different light, not just Carol's cruelty, but their own applause, their own certainty about a woman they'd never actually spoken to. Nobody organized a boycott. Nobody wrote a strongly worded email to the district. It was smaller than that. And in a town like Fenwick Heights, smaller was exactly the right size. A slow, collective recalibration, playing out over months instead of headlines. Angela didn't sue anybody, didn't write an op-ed, didn't do a single thing to extend the story past that gym floor. A few parents reached out afterward, a little sheepishly, to say they were sorry about the carnival done among them, though Dot's version came with a defensive little joke about how she would have said something if Angela's tomatoes hadn't been so distractingly mediocre that August, which was Dot's way of apologizing without quite using the word. Angela let it go the way she let most things go, quietly, without needing anyone to watch her do it. A few weeks later, on an ordinary Tuesday evening, the porch light was on at the Mercer house, and Dot was out front with a garden hose, half watering her tomato plants, half looking for an excuse to talk trash about next year's county fair. Don't think I've forgotten. I called over, loud enough that Angela caught most of it, even without looking. 4 ounces. I'm coming for you next August. Angela, sitting on her own porch step with a mug of tea going lukewarm beside her, just smiled and signed something rude enough that who'd picked up a little ASL over the years mostly out of spite, laughed out loud. Inside, later, 8:15 rolled around the way it always did. Malik's room, lights low, the two of them sitting on the edge of his bed the same way they had for years. Malik had a question that had been sitting with him for a few days. A friend of his at school, a deaf kid named Josiah, 1 grade up, had seen Angela's bedtime sign a few weeks earlier at a school pickup when Angela had absent-mindedly signed it to Malik in the parking lot. Josiah had told him, matter-of-factly, the way kids tell each other things, that it wasn't a real ASL sign, that his mom had made it up. Is it real? Malik signed now, a little worried, like he'd been walking around his whole life doing something wrong without knowing it. Angela thought about it for a second, thought about the hospital room she'd made that sign up in, half-formed, before she really knew what she was doing with her hands, before she understood the whole rest of her life was about to get built out of the space that silence had left behind. It doesn't have to be real to anybody else, she signed back. It just has to be real between us. Then she signed it to him anyway, the same clumsy, invented phrase she'd been signing every night for 10 years, the one that meant you are my sound now. And Malik settled back against his pillow, satisfied, because that was answer enough for a 10-year-old, and honestly, it was answer enough for Angela too. She turned off the light, went back downstairs, poured out the cold tea and made a fresh cup, because that's a small thing you can control on a Tuesday, and some days that's plenty. Outside, Dot's sprinkler was still running.
Here's the question worth sitting with, long after the story's over. How many people have you already decided you understand, just from the outside of them? The way somebody dresses, the car they drive, the way their voice sounds, or doesn't sound at all. It's an easy thing to do. Almost nobody does it on purpose, and almost everybody does it anyway. Angela Mercer never asked anybody at that school to see her differently. She just kept building, quietly, on her own terms, and let the truth sit there until somebody finally bothered to ask the right question out loud. If this story made you think of somebody you might have underestimated, or a time somebody underestimated you, drop it in the comments. I want to hear it. And if you've made it this far, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe, share this with somebody who needs the reminder, and I'll see you in the next one.